Good afternoon. We're so glad that you're here. Today's conversation highlights the impact of William & Mary's global reach in research. In particular, something that's unique about research at William & Mary, which is that so much of it is powered by undergraduates, many of whom are in this room. So I thought I'd start us out just by asking for a show of hands. Is there anyone here who's doing research with the Global Research Institute? How about the Institute for Integrative Conservation? And how about the Whole of Government Center of Excellence? Anyone else doing research, pursuing research in a lab or with a faculty member here at William & Mary? And I would include the faculty as well. Oh, great to see those hands. It's something that is unusual in the United States at universities to involve even freshmen from the first semester they're here at the edge of knowledge, where we're still formulating questions, not just trying to figure out the answers. William & Mary students are collaborators at the edge of knowledge here in so many different domains. I'm going to give examples just from GRI to start with. At GRI is a data lab, as some of you know. We are the global leader in providing reliable information about development aid worldwide. Aid data tracks $6 trillion of development aid, where it flows around the world every year. That lab began 20 years ago, just almost exactly 20 years ago, as an undergraduate honors thesis. So cool. It began as a curious and passionate question about tools that we did not have then, to track that flow of aid, to understand its impact and the consequences for security, for flourishing, and for peace worldwide. It's pretty extraordinary. Brad Parks, who was that undergraduate, is now one of the country's foremost experts on the impact of foreign aid in every country around the world. That's what we do. We push the edge of knowledge. That's what we think intellectual excellence, academic excellence means, involving you as learners right at the edge of knowledge. To quote Aid Data Director of Policy Analysis, Sam Custer, she says, when you have an unsolvable problem and unmeasurable data, and the methodologies that you would need to solve that don't exist yet, William & Mary is the place to go. So we are so proud to host this afternoon's discussion as part of the William & Mary, the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute 50th anniversary. And in this spirit, I'm really pleased to introduce our participants in the panel today, Professor Mike Tierney, Ambassador Mark Green, and William & Mary's 24th Chancellor, the Honorable Robert M. Gates. So just a few words about each of them. Ambassador Mark Green is President and CEO of the Wilson Center. He's the former administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development. He served as the U.S. Ambassador to Tanzania from 2007 to 2009. For 4 terms, he represented Wisconsin's 8th District in the U.S. House of Representatives. William & Mary's Chancellor, Robert M. Gates, is the former head of the CIA and Secretary of Defense. He's served under 8 U.S. presidents and is the only Secretary of Defense to have served under presidents from different political parties, something we're enormously proud of. In 2011, President Obama awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom in recognition of his devotion to U.S. service members and his commitment to the American people. Our Board of Visitors elected him Chancellor in 2012 and then reinvested him for a second term in 2019. So what that really means here, and this is maybe the most important thing, is that he has surpassed George Washington as the longest-serving American Chancellor. President Washington agreed to serve. He served for 11 years, and he served even when he was president of the United States. Some of us have been pleading with Chancellor Gates to run for president. But his wife, Becky Gates, he says, would divorce him, and we can't let that happen to him. But I do think, he doesn't look a day older than 200 years. Do you think? Professor Mike Tierney, as many of you know, directs William & Mary's Global Research Institute, and he is a builder. There are 9 research labs now at GRI. More than 250 students complete unique internship and research experiences in any given year. Nearly $16.5 million of active research grants and contracts last year were powered by that student research and faculty research together. Professor Tierney teaches international organization and policy development, and he's a William & Mary alumnus from the class of 1987. So thank you all for being here. Professor Tierney, the mic is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for kicking us off, Catherine. Is the mic mine? Can anybody hear me? Yes. Awesome. So first things first, Chancellor Gates, have you taken Ambassador Green to either the cheese shop or Paul's Deli or Wawa yet?
Not yet. Not yet.
Write that down.
You need to get on that. You haven't really been to William & Mary until you've eaten at one of those places. So before I start, I'd just like to thank both the Chancellor and the Ambassador for the way they've spent their time over the last few days. Every time Chancellor Gates comes to campus, he meets with students, and he encouraged the Ambassador to do the same. So we just came over from a meeting with a bunch of William & Mary students, and I'm incredibly grateful that you're willing to do that. So I'm going to ask a few questions and then open things up to the audience. So I'm going to start with U.S. grand strategy and national commitments. As President Rose suggested, this is the 50th anniversary of the Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center. And Secretary Gates, I'm sure when you were a history major here, you read Kennan's long telegram and understand the theory behind the U.S. containment strategy. So a Kennan-inspired question for both of you. So George Kennan consistently argued that U.S. resources and power were limited and that its foreign policy should focus on containing threats by focusing on those areas of the world that were potential power centers. He cautioned against spending blood and treasure in what he called the periphery. Today, the U.S. is less powerful than it was when he penned those words. And I guess my question really is, how does Kennan's outlook on U.S. foreign policy align with your own thinking, if at all? And are there areas of the world that the United States should prioritize over others? You get to go first.
Okay. Well, first of all, I think when Kennan wrote the long telegram, it was a far different world. And the only power center in the late 1940s, other than the United States, was the Soviet Union. So Kennan's whole proposed strategy, was essentially one of containment, that if you prevented the Soviet Union from expanding, that over time, its own internal contradictions would bring it down. And he was pretty much right. And, a lot happened in between that he disagreed with, and we became over-militarized in his view. But fundamentally, his idea was you keep them from expanding, and ultimately their own internal problems will bring them down. So there are two things that have changed that are really quite extraordinary. First of all, there is now not just one other power center. And what in Kennan's day was the periphery, in some ways is now central. So right now, for example, we can't be oblivious to 4 wars going on in the Middle East. And we certainly can't be oblivious to China and the military, economic, and political challenge that China poses to the United States and to the developed democracies. So in a way, it's a measure of how much the world has changed and the multipolarity of the world today compared with Kennan's time, that it really is difficult to adhere to what he prescribed then, because you can't ignore either Russia or China, and you certainly can't ignore the Middle East. And I would argue, and it's a deficiency in U.S. policy in my view, I think we have, apart from the Middle East, neglected the global South under multiple presidents, and essentially given the Chinese free open field running. They're now the biggest trading partner of more than 120 countries around the world. And we're struggling with all of that. So we have to deal with multiple other power centers. And the final thing I'll say is I think the one piece of advice from Kennan that is still relevant is that you can't waste your resources on secondary or tertiary kinds of threats, and particularly I would say in terms of military engagement. We really do need to focus the capabilities we have on Russia and on China. Those are the two keys in terms of at least our military. Our non-military instruments are applicable everywhere. But in that respect, I think Kennan continues to be correct that we need to keep our eye on the ball when it comes to where we are willing to engage. I've held the view for a long time that the patience of the American people is very limited when it comes to conflicts overseas. And we've seen that now in the reaction kind of across the political spectrum to 20 years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And kind of where are we for all of that? So I think in that respect, Kennan remains relevant in keeping focused on the main threat.
Ambassador Green, I'm guessing you've done a lot of thinking about George Kennan this year.
Very much so. First, I'm from Wisconsin, like me, so we'll take some credit for George Kennan. First off, it's an honor to share the stage with Secretary Gates. I'm a big fan of all that he has done and all that he has led and the work being done here. Just to build on a couple of things, I think what we see today is also, what I hope we have, is a better understanding of the sources of power. I worry a great deal that we have neglected some of our economic statecraft, which is really important to creating the economic might and creating some of the alliances and relationships that are vital to our hard security as well. And in particular, very much agree, particularly with what's known as the Global South. I'm sort of an Africa guy by outlook. The first trip each year that the Chinese foreign minister takes for the last 31 years in a row is to Africa. If a cabinet secretary goes to Africa from the U.S., it's front page news that's all over the place. And I sometimes get called and I said, look, I don't want it to be news. I want it to be so commonplace and so regular that it isn't news. We're slow. We are slow to the game, and we're slow-footed, and we are failing to build those relationships that should naturally be ours. We have a young continent. They want the kinds of economic opportunity that are at the heart of who we are, and yet we are not paying nearly enough attention. I think that's crucial, and that is very much an updated kind of notion as well.
Right. I'll bellow one more time. Thank you. Maybe I won't bellow. Can you hear me now? Not yet. All right. Can you hear me now? Yeah. What a great country. Okay. Ambassador Green, earlier this year you traveled to Ukraine with UNHCR to survey the destruction caused by Russia there. What were some of the observations from the trip, and how do you assess the spirit of the Ukrainian people, if I could ask that?
Sure, and it was a few months ago now. It was in the spring. A few things, and I sort of had a bookend experience in Ukraine. In 2014, I traveled to Ukraine with Madeleine Albright to serve as an election observer in their first post-Euromaidan elections. Extraordinarily impressed with the strength and the resilience of the Ukrainian people as they went to exercise their right to vote. What I saw this spring was that same courage, that same resilience in the face of enormous pressure. So that was one observation. Secondly, the extraordinary adaptability and resilience of the Ukrainian people who, buildings destroyed and within hours they're back doing what they can to adapt and to rebuild. I saw students going to classes in subway stations next to schools that had been destroyed. They're making sure that their young people have a crack at education, so the resilience is there. Secondly, I was struck by how in the US we talk about the conflict differently than they do in Europe. Our media talks about Ukraine, Russia as though it's a narrow bilateral conflict. In Europe, they see this very differently. They believe that this is tyranny on the march and that so much of Europe is under threat and that Putin is not going to stop. He will keep going. The Moldovans certainly agree with that. We talk about it in different ways. And third, I think it was also striking to me how closely the Ukrainians are paying attention to the way that we talk about the conflict. I was there around the time that the supplemental legislation in Congress to provide funding was up for a vote. And I would talk to Ukrainians and they would ask me about the votes and they would bring up terms like filibuster and talk about that insider baseball term. That's how closely they were watching what was going on in Washington, D.C. I had a soldier come up to me in front of St. Michael's, which is that gorgeous, beautiful, bright cathedral monastery. And he came up to me, I was there, and he came up to me and figured out I was an American. And he looked at me and he said, I have a question. Are you going to be with us? And this is around the time of the supplemental. So my answer was, I think so. And they're not asking us to put people in place. They're simply asking for us to stand with them and provide them the tools that they need to preserve their sovereignty, to preserve their culture. And they believe, and Europe believes, that they are not only fighting for Ukraine, they're fighting for containment, and they're fighting for Europe. They're fighting for democracy, and they're fighting for the West.
Sticking with Ukraine for a moment, Mr. Secretary, you once defined the Russia-Ukraine conflict as an era-defining moment. In 2007, Vladimir Putin gave a speech at the Munich Security Conference where you were in the front row. What lessons do you think the U.S. and the international community should have learned back then regarding Putin's rhetoric? He doesn't always follow through on all of his rhetoric. Did you have a clear sense of where this was going?
First of all, the setting. This was at the Munich Security Conference, and the first few rows are actually, you're seated at narrow tables. And I was in the front row as Secretary of Defense and seated right on the aisle, and right across the aisle from me was Putin. And next to Putin was Angela Merkel, and next to her was Yushchenko, the Ukrainian leader Putin tried to kill by poisoning. When Merkel got up to give her opening remarks for the conference, the look that Yushchenko gave Putin was the most unadulterated look of pure hatred I've ever seen in my entire life. You know, like, you tried to kill me. And when Putin got up, he basically gave this speech that accused the United States of everything that's wrong in the world, and our overreach, our trying to dictate the rules and so on. And he went on and on and on and on. And the way I've described it is that our first instinct in hearing the speech, first of all, it was so negative that generally a pro-Russian audience, this is 2007, of Europeans turned very hostile. All the questions that he got were very hostile questions from what otherwise would have been a more measured audience. But what we thought initially was a harangue was in fact a harbinger. It basically was the turning point. He had decided that, and Putin has gone through an evolution. Putin has changed since he became president in 2000. And I think the turning point for Putin, first of all, he was always going to be an autocrat because he had to put Russia back together after the 1990s. The oligarchs controlled the economy. The regional governors controlled the country. They weren't even able to collect taxes in Moscow. And so first of all, he had to get rid of the power of the oligarchs, and then he had to rein in the power of the governor. So he was always going to be an autocrat. It wasn't inevitable, in my view, that he would become so hostile to the West. I think the real turning point for him was the color revolutions in 2003, 2004, above all the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. He saw that as completely the work of the West, of CIA, of the NGOs, the Endowment for Democracy, all of the Western organizations that were active in Russia trying to help them build democratic institutions and sort of put in place a democratic system of government. He regarded as efforts to overthrow the government of Russia, of those countries. And it was Ukraine, Georgia, and Kyrgyzstan. And he became convinced that Russia was next, that we were coming after him. And so 2007 follows that fairly shortly, and that's when you basically hear this is a different kind of Putin than we saw immediately after 9/11. And it's only gotten worse since then, as he has become convinced that it is his destiny to recreate the Russian Empire. Not the Soviet Union, but the Russian Empire. But that includes a lot of territories, including Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine, potentially parts of Poland, some parts of Central Asia, and so on. And this is where he is. And so I think, I got up the next day and I said, and people were waiting to see what I was going to say in response to what he had said. And my response was to try and cool it, was to chill. And basically, I said, one Cold War was quite enough, thank you very much. And I tried to have fun with it. I basically said, look, we're just a couple of old spies, Putin and me. The difference is I've been to re-education camp. I've been a university president. And, it went down well with the Europeans. But the other piece of his talk that is worth mentioning is he comes down off the stage having delivered this harbinger speech, walks straight to me, smiles, sticks out his hand to shake hands, and invites me to visit Russia. I said, sure, I'll come. Can I come home? And I went to Russia. So I actually would meet with him several times after that, and we had a pretty cordial relationship. I was with him when he got word that Boris Yeltsin had died. So this is a guy who has evolved, and he has evolved in all the wrong directions, and he continues to evolve in those directions.
I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit to military and economic assistance to Ukraine and Israel. Traditionally, both economic and military assistance to allies has garnered bipartisan support among U.S. politicians. And so my question is, will Congress continue to support the president's requests to spend taxpayer dollars to support Israel and Ukraine? And if you were going to give advice, how should the U.S. government alter or condition the amount, the composition, or the conditions that they attach to their foreign assistance to Israel and Ukraine?
So, first off, let me raise some of the concerns that I have right now. The dollar figures involved are astronomical. And I'm very much worried when you take a look at humanitarian assistance, emergency food, emergency medicine, particularly for those who have been displaced, the numbers keep rising. There are 130 million displaced people in the world right now. 400,000 kids were born as refugees last year. These numbers are skyrocketing, and I'm worried that those numbers are beginning to eat into development assistance. The long-term investments in education, in training, in health, that help young people secure a brighter future. I'm very much worried that these numbers are becoming unsustainable. We need to do a much better job, whether it be naming and shaming or whatever it might take, to bring more people, more countries, more donors together. I'm not suggesting the U.S. should do less. I'm suggesting others need to do more because these numbers are, as I said, astronomical. So that, I think, is piece of it. Secondly, when it comes to topics of rebuilding, I think there are important things to keep in mind. A lot of people, when they talk about rebuilding, they mean it in the literal terms, reconstruction, brick and mortar. That's actually not it. That's easy. We know how to do that. Anybody can do that. I think the great challenges that we see coming up are how you build responsive governance, how you sow civil society, how you sort of pull together the threads of what holds a community together and gives people some hope that their future will be brighter. And that is very difficult work, and we don't tend to have much patience for that work in our political landscape. But I was talking with a group before. It was very interesting polling done in Gaza right before October 7th. And the Palestinians who were surveyed in Gaza said, we don't support Hamas, we don't support the PA, we actually don't support anybody. Nobody's actually listening to us and helping us with our day-to-day needs. And I think that's right. The work of pulling together the threads and building that part of the future in a Ukraine, in displaced communities around the world, and in places like the Middle East, that's hard work. It's going to be generational work. The students who I spoke to earlier, it's your work. You're going to be doing this for a long time. It's vitally important because peace in the world depends upon the success of what we do. So I think those are the things that we need to be thinking about, and I don't see enough attention being paid to it. Final piece I'll say on Ukraine reconstruction, it's very important to listen to the Ukrainians. What is it that they want? They want to join the EU, they want to join NATO. They're looking westward. We need to help them. We don't need to lead. Europe should lead. They want to be part of Europe. We need to help them get there. We need to help them undertake the kinds of reforms, those things that are prerequisites for more formally joining. That's what they want. That's what we should want. And I think there's a way to do that. But again, it's a long slog. It's going to require patience and resources. And I think we need to do a better job back here in the U.S. in talking with our policymakers and opinion leaders on why this needs to be done.
So I think that the odds of another $60 billion package for Ukraine are very low, no matter who is elected president. I think the Congress, with all the other things that are going on, I think that a massive aid package of that magnitude for Ukraine is not in the cards. I think there will be support for more assistance for Ukraine and to sell more weapons to Ukraine. I think there will be some support for reconstruction, both of the physical and the governance that Mark is talking about. But in those areas in particular, the expectation, I think, of all of our political leaders, again, across the spectrum, is going to be for the Europeans to take the lead in that. And the Europeans have committed about 40 billion euros for the next year for those kinds of things and some military assistance to Ukraine. But the key is tying Ukraine to Europe. Whether NATO membership is in the cards, my guess is not soon. Just because, I didn't think it was in the cards when President Bush called for it in 2008, and I was at the Bucharest summit, NATO summit, where he did. And I told him, I said, there's just no way in the world France or Germany gonna support this, and sure enough, they didn't. And so I think that's more problematic. I think EU membership is much more in the cards, much more likely. I think that, there will be a difference in terms of our policy toward Ukraine, depending on who is elected president. There's just no question about that. But I think in the Congress, I think you will see continued bipartisan support for helping the Ukrainians. It's just, kind of how much money and for what purposes, and compared to others. And you mentioned Israel. I would say, the only thing I would say there is, and you talked about conditionality. I think it's basically the administration's way past due in dropping the hammer and saying, if you don't allow X amount of humanitarian assistance into Gaza, our military assistance will stop.
You have thoughts on conditions to Israel?
So, as a development guy, what I always tell people when the question of Gaza and Israel comes up, let's be clear, every day that goes by is a bad day. There are hostages, including American hostages, and there are people who are suffering and in need of emergency food and emergency medicine. And we simply have to be part of finding the answers to creating the conditions to reconcile both of those. Today obviously was a day of moment in terms of Sinwar's apparent death. Let's hope it creates opportunities. But every day that goes by is a bad day. And I think we have to keep that in our minds and in our thoughts and prayers. There's a lot of suffering going on.
Great. Just two more questions from me, and then I'll turn these guys over to you. So we have a presidential election coming up.
Really?
Yeah. I just heard that today. What's at stake here for U.S. national security?
Virginia must not be a swing state.
We get our fair share of commercials. But how will U.S. foreign policy be different or similar under a Trump versus Harris administration? You could go on for hours. I would ask just pick your favorite one or two issue areas where you think the election might be consequential. You can go first, Secretary Gates.
Okay, so I think actually there are several areas where, perhaps surprisingly to people, there will be quite a bit of continuity. One is policy toward China. There is very broad bipartisan support in the Congress and between the two presidential candidates of China as an adversary, and particularly in terms, and not only militarily, but also economically. And you will see gradations of actions, but just as President Biden has not reversed any of President Trump's tariffs on China, I don't think you'll see a President Harris do that either. And I think you'll see a lot more tariffs if President Trump is elected. So I think with respect to China, there's going to be quite a bit of continuity. I think there'll be quite a bit of continuity in the Middle East. I think President Trump was very proud of the Abraham Accords and the diplomacy that led to that normalization. He's very strongly in support of Israel, as has Harris been. I think you'll see a more nuanced policy in terms of the Palestinians and so on under Harris than you would a Trump. But fundamentally, I think U.S. policy toward the Middle East, toward the Gulf states and so on, and toward Iran is going to be pretty similar no matter who is elected president. I think that, and I think on trade policy, if there are any free trade advocates left in the Congress, I can't find them. And it used to be mainly Republicans. The Democrats have always been kind of skeptical of trade agreements for both environmental and labor reasons. But Republicans have been the advocates for free trade, and now the Republicans are nowhere to be seen on that issue. So I think you're going to see a lot more autarkic policies of trying to make the United States more reducing our dependency on global trading networks and agreements and so on. And then the final one I would mention, and Ukraine we've talked about, and I think there will be some real differences there. And the final one I would talk about, which is disappointing, is frankly, I don't see much interest in either party or by either candidate in greater U.S. engagement with the global South. And this is another one of those finally things. The other thing, and I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post about this a month ago, I don't see either candidate articulating an understanding of the strategic challenges the United States face that go back to the very first question you asked, or the necessity of significant changes in our defense spending to increase defense spending, but also significant reform in the Defense Department to spend that money more wisely and to advance modernization and innovation.
Ambassador Green, I'm going to interpret that answer as all of the things that are going to be the same, and that the election doesn't matter for national security policy in those domains. So you now have the task of telling us what will be different in the two administrations.
So, leading an institution that's covered by the Hatch Act, I will politely duck a good part of that question. But what I will point to, so let me point to a few areas of actually shift a bit that I think there's some reason for hope and optimism coming out of the elections. What doesn't get enough coverage, I'm very optimistic and upbeat on the congressional leaders in foreign policy on both sides of the aisle. On the committees of jurisdiction, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Senate Foreign Relations Committee, we have good seasoned hands on both sides of the aisle who work well together. And I think that that's been something that we should all look at with pride. I think Ben Cardin's loss is a big loss when he retires at the end of the year, but there have been some really solid work done there. And my hope is, because there are lots of fires burning and lots of challenges that are out there, I hope they will continue to work together, because I believe coming forward with proposals that have support from the leadership in the committees from both sides, I think the next president will be eager to embrace them, because there are real opportunities. And then finally, I'll point to something, or maybe echo and accentuate what the Secretary just said on the trade front. I'm disappointed at the loss of economic statecraft, the rescission or receding from that. Throughout my entire career, the sort of unspoken deal that we offered the developing world is, look, we want to go, we'll give you some aid, but we want you to go from being aid recipients to partners to fellow donors. I don't know how you get there if you don't have vibrant trade, and you don't have commerce, and you don't have that economic statecraft that fosters the investments. And if we don't do that, China is very happy to. And that worries me a great deal. We need to remember what it is that countries are looking for in the South. They're looking for opportunities. They're looking for a growing economy. Whether it was my time as ambassador, when I traveled with USAID, when I would meet with foreign heads of state, they would never ask for food. They would never ask for medicine. They wanted help to create jobs. They wanted investment. And somehow that isn't on the agenda, that isn't on the discussion agenda right now, and I'm hoping that changes after the elections.
Great. I have 10 more questions, but my boss is looking at me and she's saying, you need to open this up to the students. So we're going to do that now. The way this is going to work is we're going to take 3 questions at a time. So when the microphone comes to you, tell us who you are and then ask a question. Don't give a speech. We're going to get 3 questions on the table, and then I'll ask our panelists to choose which questions they'd like to respond to. So just raise your hand. We've got some microphones coming around. This young lady right there. And if there's another microphone right up here in the front. Fire.
Thank Oh, you're going to hold it. Great. Hi, I'm Beth Salakovan. I'm a proud member of the class of 1983. And it was a great pleasure in my life from 1998 until his death in 2005 to live down the street from Ambassador Kennan and his wife, Annalise. So I know I'm very familiar with containment. I'm very happy that we're talking about it today. However, I think I'm not a diplomat. I'm a very known throughout this community as being one of the most blunt people. My Wall Street career attests to that. And I am very sad, Ambassador, to hear you talk about the astronomical cost for Ukraine. It is astronomical. So was the Marshall Plan. Mm-hmm. So I think, and there are great people on both sides. No, the leadership did not approve Ukrainian aid. So I want your response to...
Let her ask her question. Ask your question, Beth.
Forget the other countries. This is the responsibility of the United States. And we have a divided country, and we need to lead. Are you leading at the Wilson Center on this, or are you waiting? It's containment. We need to do containment.
Okay, thanks. Up in the front.
Hi, I'm a sophomore studying economics and international relations.
What's your name?
Luke. So my question is, you mentioned the developing world. So what should U.S. military and economic policy, specifically in Africa, look like to try and address these problems and deal with the global south? Thank you.
Okay, let's get that one more question right up there. Real quick. Daniel. This young lady in the white pants then. Let's go. Give her the microphone.
Hi, my name is Sarah Helena Maripodi. I'm a senior here, and I was wondering about the Russian and Ukraine war. I know that we have expected Russia to run out of its resources, and we see reports on many of their men dying, being untrained, evading the draft, etc. But at the same time, we still see the war going on much longer than expected. So what is your view on Russian resources? Will they run out on their own, or do we need to fight more against them?
Secretary Gates, you want to go first?
Okay, I'll take the last one first. I think people have significantly underestimated Russia, and it probably has to do with not reading enough Russian history. The Russians have historically performed badly at the beginning of virtually all their wars, regrouped, replaced their generals, and eventually let Russian size and mass and territory be successful, be victorious. So the Russians have 9 times the economy of Ukraine, 3 times the population. The Russians, by most accounts, have lost about 600,000 men in the war, 200,000 killed. By comparison, they lost 15,000 killed in 10 years of war in Afghanistan. But the Russians are putting 30,000 new troops a month into Ukraine. They're mainly drawing them from the Central Asian parts, from rural areas, and so on. They're pretty careful about recruiting out of St. Petersburg and Moscow because that's where the elites live. And they don't want to recruit their sons. They want all these other kids to do the bleeding. And they are drawing down the stocks of Soviet equipment that they inherited, most of which is pretty old and a lot of which doesn't work. But they have, over the last year and a half, with a lot of help from China, revitalized their defense industries, and they are now producing more artillery shells. They are producing more tanks, more drones, and so on, drones with Iranian help. So I think to underestimate Putin's ability to carry on this war is a huge mistake, and to underestimate his determination to carry on this war is a mistake. And right now, he thinks he's winning. And he has been able to escape the main effect of the sanctions, mainly due to support from the Central Asian countries and especially to China. China has been very careful not to cross the line of providing actual weapons to Russia, but they have provided everything but that. Machine tools, semiconductors, you name it. And trade between Russia and China has exploded over the last 2 years. So I think the Russians can sustain this war until Putin thinks he has won. And he thinks he's winning now. And I would just say this about the incursion into Russia, the Kursk incursion. My personal view is that that was a strategic mistake. That's 30,000 very good Ukrainian troops that I think should have been used to strengthen the front in the Donbass, where they are under huge pressure and the Russians are very slowly moving forward, taking one village at a time. And let me just say, in terms of assistance to in the developing world, I will just give you one example of what I regard as the epitome of an American assistance program that did amazing work and also gained the United States huge benefit, and that is the PEPFAR program started by President Bush, the President's Emergency Program for Emergency AIDS Relief. That program saved a minimum of 25 million lives in Africa. And we did it because we partnered with the African countries. We didn't tell them everything they had to do. We partnered with them. We empowered our embassies to partner with them. The embassies in African country, our embassies, had enormous influence and a role to play in PEPFAR. And we helped create what was crude but effective network of healthcare centers throughout these countries that continues to exist. It was an amazingly successful program, had enormously powerful bipartisan support in the Congress. It was started by President Bush and has continued to this day. But I turn the rest of that question over to Mark.
Ambassador Green, choose your poison.
Sure. Well, let me, first off, I'm a huge believer in PEPFAR. I'm one of the original supporters, was the whip that gathered the votes for the legislation. It changed the course of human history in Africa. And I will say, because reauthorization is up for consideration by Congress, it's terrifically important that it gets reauthorized, because it's also about keeping our word and our promise to Africa. We made a long-term commitment, and many African countries had to do difficult things in order to qualify. And so I think it's really important that we continue that. And the Secretary is right. At the heart of PEPFAR and at the heart of Feed the Future and our most successful development programs, you begin by listening, not finger wagging. You come in and you explore the values that are shared, the objectives that are shared, and how we work together to get there. That's the key to anything successful in terms of development. You know, on Ukraine, I'm a bleeding heart for Ukraine. I've been several times. I was an early election observer. The Kennan Institute, we do a ton of work on Ukraine. So I'm a big believer in the Ukrainian people, the remarkable resilience, the creativity, and all that they've done and all that they are doing. My point in terms of the astronomical cost is I do worry about what's coming in terms of all of these, particularly on the humanitarian side, making sure that we have sustainable budgets to support those programs. It is important. It's really important, because it will, if we're not careful, cannibalize some of those development investments going into Ukraine that they really want. So that is the point that I wanted to make. It is interesting in terms of Russia. I believe that Putin's recent budget that he submitted, 40% of the budget is defense spending. Here NATO is fighting over whether or not they're going to get to 2%, and Putin's devoting 40%. And so I think it reinforces what the Secretary has said. They're on a wartime footing, their economy. Everything is being shifted in that direction, and we should not underestimate the lengths that they'll go to, which makes them even more, quite frankly, dangerous. In the Global South, I think the key to everything is understanding that you have, for example, in Africa, the youngest continent, people who want the same things that we want. Their young people want jobs, they want opportunities, they want to reach their dreams. And that is natural work for us. That's where we want to be. And I think partnering with them and designing ways to help them get there, it's good for them, it's good for us, and we build and expand our relationships and our alliances around the world.
Let's take another round of questions. You got a microphone up here in the front, and then right there in the second row, green sweatshirt, and then in the red sweater at the front. Go ahead, you're first.
I want to follow up on...
Can you identify yourself?
Yes, my name is Arman. I'm a sophomore studying IR and business. I want to follow up on the Africa aid question. Ambassador Green, you brought up something important about how in previous engagements with the Global South, we've had conditions for engagement that have forced them to, change their domestic policy, and I think you said bend over backwards. The Belt and Road Initiative doesn't have a lot of the same conditions and is more attractive for some of these countries in the Global South. How can we make our sphere of influence more attractive for these countries?
Martina.
You stole my introduction. Hi, my name is Martina. I'm a freshman studying international relations and economics. And I recently attended a panel about former members of the Afghani military who talked about being displaced following American withdrawal from Afghanistan and how they were awaiting achieving refugee status and wanting to reunite with their families. Do you think it's the responsibility of the US government to reunite these individuals with their families, and what can we do to better support them following American withdrawal?
Thanks. Red sweater, right here, second row.
Hello, my name is Theodora. I'm a freshman studying IR. And I was just curious about your perspectives regarding the feasibility of a two-state solution within Israel and Palestine, and if not, what conditions could possibly lead to reconciliation? Thank you.
Ambassador Green.
I'll begin with the very good question with respect to Belt and Road Initiative. So, I think sometimes when we look at Belt and Road and we look at the partnerships we wish to strike with the developing world, I think we look at it the wrong way. Number one, China is not the preferred partner. In many cases, the reason that a country will go with Chinese financing, and I've asked some of these heads of state, they'll say, because you weren't there. We want to go with the US, you're not there. We have needs, we have to create jobs, we have to make investments for our young people, we would like to partner with you. And so I worry a great deal that we are not involved and engaged in the game, if you will, and that is a significant concern. Secondly, we shouldn't try to be China light. I don't think we should look at these programs in terms of dollar for dollar. If anybody thinks we're going to spend $1 trillion on infrastructure in Africa, it's not going to happen. But that's not our model. That's not what we offer. My view, and I used to say this in my days at USAID, the purpose of American foreign assistance is ending its need to exist. We want to help countries lead themselves, and that's the deal that we offer. We go to our friends and we say, look, we want to help you get what we call the American dream for us. It's your own version. We want to help you get there. We want to help you to be self-reliant. We want to help you to be growing and vibrant. We want to help you provide opportunities for your young people. Our investments, what we do, is designed to help you along the way. So all of our programs, I used to measure at aid using our metrics. How much closer to self-reliance does it help a country get? If an investment from a Chinese state-owned entity leads to a country becoming more self-reliant, somebody in Beijing is going to lose their job because it's the opposite of what they want. They want to build subservience, quite frankly, and dependence, and they want to build a sphere of influence, and they want to build a client state. That is what we should be selling, because that's what countries want. And so I think sometimes we look at it the wrong way. In terms of I'll defer to the Secretary on some of the other topics. I will say with respect to what's going on tragically in the Middle East, I worry about the years ahead. I worry about the long slog that lies ahead in trying to promote reconciliation and trying to find ways to create those institutions that can help young people who have all kinds of economic challenges before the war and the conflict. We need to find ways to help sow that and support that and foster that.
So with respect to Afghanistan, I think the end game in Afghanistan was a bipartisan failure. I think that the agreement that President Trump struck, that we would pull all of our forces out by a date certain, was a strategic mistake. I think that the Biden administration's agreement to continue that agreement, except just a few months later, was equally a mistake. And the argument is made, well, President Trump decided this, and so we just were doing what he agreed. Well, I mean, it's not like the Biden administration hasn't overturned other things President Trump did. So the notion that they couldn't adjust this strikes me as a little unrealistic. The end game was so mismanaged. We could have, for a very modest price, kept about 4,000 of our troops there. What people didn't know, or nobody paid much attention to, was that if we had kept 4,000 troops there, our allied partners were going to keep another 5,000 or 6,000 troops there. And what made that important was they provided the security for the contractors who actually supported the Afghan army. The logistics, the food, the medicine, the medevac, the resupply of ammunition, and so on. And when we pulled all of our troops out, all those contractors left, and it's no surprise that the Afghan army collapsed. Now, here's what should have been done. Once President Trump made that agreement, the Defense Department, and I hold the Defense Department accountable in this regard, as well as the State Department, Defense Department should have taken all those people. We could not possibly take into this country or elsewhere all of the people in the Afghan army. But we did have an obligation to help those who had helped us, who had been our interpreters, who had worked with our troops, who had supported our troops, and so on. We should have gotten contact information for all of those people. We should have told them that in the event of a major evacuation, this is the airfield you should go to. We should have maintained control of several airfields, not just Kabul International, but Kandahar in the south, Herat in the west, Jalalabad in the east, Mazar-e Sharif in the north, as well as Bagram, so that you didn't have to travel all the way across Afghanistan with your documents proving you had worked for the United States, going through Taliban checkpoints, for God's sake. And then, when things began to fall apart, you could have gotten a message. I mean, all these people have cell phones. Go to this airfield, and we will evacuate you, for the people we had helped. This was incredibly mismanaged. And it was the Trump administration, it was the Biden administration, it was the Department of Defense, and it was the Department of State, all of which I think bear considerable responsibility for what I think has proven to be a real disaster.
If I can just add one thing that I would commend to anyone who's interested. I was part of the Afghanistan study group that was housed at USIP right after I left USAID, and its recommendations actually very much in line with what you were saying. It also noted the remarkable progress had been made inside Afghanistan in a number of measures in women's health and so on and so forth. And we look today in Afghanistan, it's about as dark a place as we can imagine. I mean, and I wrote about this recently. So there was a polio outbreak in Gaza, and Israel and Hamas suspended fighting so that health officials could go in and immunize children. Around the same time, the Taliban suspended their immunization campaign And so people aren't getting vaccinated for polio. And that just shows you how dark that has become, and it is a terrible tragedy.
And before the tragedy, before that tragic outcome, millions of Afghan girls were going to school and had a future.
Gentlemen, this was insightful, if not uplifting. Thank you for kicking off our homecoming
Well, it is
weekend.
the cocktail hour.
That's right. It's time to get a drink. Please join me in thanking Ambassador Green and Secretary Gates. Well done, gentlemen.